Welcome! Today I'm going to read part 2 of chapter 6 of The Call of the Wild. That winter at Dawson, Buck performed another exploit. Not so heroic, perhaps, but one that put his name many notches higher on the totem pole of Alaskan fame. This exploit was particularly gratifying to the three men, for they stood in need of the outfit which it furnished and were enabled to make a long-desired trip to the Virgin East, where miners had not yet appeared. It was brought about by a conversation in the Eldorado saloon, which men waxed boastful of their favorite dogs. Buck, because of his record, was the target for these men, and Thornton was driven shortly to defend him. At the end of the half hour, one man stated that his dog could start a sled with 500 pounds and walk off with it. A second bragged 600 for his dog, and a third 700. Pooh, John Thornton. Buck can start 1,000 pounds. And break it out and walk off with it for 100 yards, demanded Newsom, a Bonanza king. He was of the 700 vaunt. And break it out and walk off with it for 100 yards, John Thornton said coolly. Well, Mathewson said, slowly and deliberately, so that all could hear, I've got $1,000 here. Says he can't. And there it is. So, saying, he slammed a stack of gold dust of the size of Bonanza sausage down upon the bar, or bologna sausage down upon the bar. Nobody spoke. Thornton's bluff. If bluff it was, he had been called. He could feel a flush of warm blood creeping up his face. His tongue had tricked him. He did not know whether Buck could start 1,000 pounds. Half a ton? The enormousness of it appalled him. He had a great faith in Buck's strength, and had often thought of him capable of starting such a load, but never, as now, had he faced the possibility of it. The eyes of a dozen men fixed upon him, silent and waiting. Further, he had no $1,000, nor Hans, nor Pete. I've got a sled standing outside with my 50-pound sacks of flour in it, Mathewson went out with brutal directness, so don't let that hinder you. Thornton did not reply. He did not know what to say. He glanced from face to face in the absent way of a man who has lost the power of thought and is seeking somewhere to find the thing that will start it going again. The face of Jim O'Brien, a Matson king, an old-time comrade, caught his eyes. It was a cue to him, seeming to rouse him to do what he would never have dreamed of doing. Can you lend me 1,000? He asked, almost in a whisper. Sure, answered O'Brien, thumping down a pathetic sack by the side of Mathewson. Though it's little faith I'm having, John, that beast can do the trick. The Eldorado emptied its occupants into the street to see the test. The tables were deserted, and the dealers came and gamekeepers came forth to see the outcome of the wager and to lay odds. Several hundred men banked around the sled with easy distance. Mathewson's sled, loaded with 1,000 pounds of flour, had been standing for a couple of hours and in the intense cold. It was 60 below zero. The runners had frozen fast through the hard-packed snow. Men offered of 2 to 1 that Buck would not bulge the sled. A quibble arose concerning the phrase, break out. O'Brien contended it was Thornton's privilege to knock the runners loose, leaving Buck to break it out from dead standstill. Mathewson insisted that the phase included breaking the runners from the frozen grip of the snow. A majority of the men who had witnessed the making of the bet decided in his favor, where the odds went up to 3-1 against Buck. 3-1 against Buck. There were no takers. Not a man believed him capable of the feat. Thornton had been hurried to the wager, heavy with doubt, and now that he looked at the sled itself, the concrete fact with a regular team of 10 dogs curled up in the snow before it, the more impossible the task appeared. Mathewson waxed jubilant. 3-1, he proclaimed. I'll lay you down another 1,000 at that figure, Thornton. What do you say? 3-1, he proclaimed. Thornton's doubt was strong in his face, but his fighting spirit was aroused. The fighting spirit that soars up above the odds, fails to recognize the impossible, and is deaf to all who save the clamor for battle. He called Hans and Pete to him. Their slacks were slim, and with his own, the three partners could rake together only $200. In the ebb of their fortunes, the sum was their total capital, yet they laid it unhesitatingly against Matthewson's 600. The team of 10 dogs was unhitched, and Buck, with his own harness, was to put into the sled. He had caught the excitement and felt that in some way he must do a great thing for John Thornton. Murmurs of admiration at the splendid appearance went up. He was in perfect condition, without an ounce of superfluous flesh, and the 150 pounds that he weighed were so many pounds of grit and vitality. His furry coat shone with the sheen of silk. Down the neck and across the shoulders, his mane, as it was, half bristled and seemed to lift with every movement, as though excessive vigor made each particular hair alive and active. The great breast and heavy forelegs were no more than in proportion with the rest of the body, where the muscles showed in tight rolls underneath the skin. Men felt these muscles and proclaimed them hard as iron, and the odds went down to 2-1. Glad, sir, suffered a member of the latest dynasty, a king of the Shokun branches. I offer you 800 for him, sir, before the test, sir, 800 just as stands. Thornton shook his head and stepped to Buck's side. You must stand off from him, Matthewson protested. Free play and plenty of room. The crowd felt silent. Only could be heard the voices of the gamblers vainly offered 2-1. Everybody acknowledged Buck a magnificent animal, but 50-pound sacks of flour, both too large in their eyes for them to loosen their pouch strings. Thornton knelt down by Buck's side. He took his head in two hands and rested cheek on cheek. He did not playfully shake him, as was his wont, or murmur soft love curses, but he whispered in his ear, "As you love me, Buck, as you love me," was what he whispered. Buck whined with suppressed eagerness. The crowd was watching curiously. The affair was growing mysterious. It seemed like a conjuration. As Thornton got to his feet, Buck seized his mittened hand between his jaws, pressing in with his teeth and releasing slowly, half reluctantly. It was the answer in terms, not of speech, but of love. Thornton stepped well back. Now, Buck, he said. Buck tightened the traces, then stacked them for a matter of several inches. It was the way he had learned. Thornton's voice rang out sharp in the tense silence. Buck swung to the right, ending the movement in a plunge that took up the sack and with sudden jerk arrested to 150 pounds. The load quivered, and from under the runners arose a crisp crackling. "Half," Thornton commanded. Buck duplicated the maneuver, this time to the left, the crackling turning into snapping, the sled pivoting, and the runners shipping and grating several inches to the side. The sled was broken out. Men were holding their breaths intensely, unconscious of the fact. "Now, mush!" Thornton's command cracked out like a pistol shot, but Buck threw himself forward, tightening the traces with a jarring lunge. His whole body was gathered compactly together in the tremendous effort, the muscles withering and knotting like live things under silky fur. His great chest was low to the ground and his head forward and down, while the feet were lying mad, the claws scarring the hard-packed snow in parallel grooves. The sled swayed and trembled, half started forward. One of his feet slipped, and one man groaned aloud. Then the sled lurched ahead in what appeared a rapid succession of jerks, though it never really came to a dead stop again. Half an inch, 2 inches, the jerks perpetually diminished. As the sled gained momentum, he caught them up, till it was moving steadily along. Men gasped and began to breathe again, unaware for the moment they had ceased to breathe. Thornton was running behind, encouraging Buck with short, cheery words. The distance had been measured off, and he neared the pile of firewood which marked the end of the 100 yards. A cheer began to grow and grow, which burst into a roar as he passed the firewood and halted at command. Every man was tearing himself loose, even Matheson. Hats and mittens were flying in the air. Men were shaking hands. It did not matter with whom, and bubbling over in general incoherent battle. But Thornton fell on his knees beside Buck. Head was against head, and he was shaking him back and forth. Those who hurried up heard him cursing Buck, and he cursed him long and fervently, and softly and lovingly. Glad, sir, sputtered the shockman. Beach King, I'll give you 1,000 for him, sir, 1,000, sir, 1,200, sir. Thornton rose to his feet. His eyes were wet. The tears were streaming frankly down his cheeks. Sir, he said. No, sir, you can't go blazes, sir. It's the best I can do for you, sir. Buck seized Thornton's hand in his teeth. Thornton shook him back and forth, as though animated by common impulse. The onlookers drew back in a respectful distance, nor were they, again, indiscreet enough to interrupt. And that concludes that chapter. Our question for this part of the chapter is, how does John Thornton behave differently in the wilderness and in the boom towns? Thanks.